All right, everybody, come on in. It is Friday, April 3rd. Just a bit of news. Earlier today, Iran shot down a U.S. jet fighter. Two pilots were lost. One has been recovered. The other is still lost. They were, of course, shot down by the non-existent anti-aircraft fire that's still in the hands of the Iranians after our president came on for 19 minutes and told the country they couldn't do this. They went and did it. So you can put that in this pack. And today he gave us a budget. And that budget is a $1.5 trillion for the military, with huge cuts to things like FEMA and historically Black colleges and all of science and zeroed out things like help for low-income energy assistance in this year. So if budgets represent priorities and you are already confused or still confused about the priorities of this monster, I don't think you should be anymore. Anyway, I am joined today by the fabulous Andrea Pitzer. She is a journalist, a podcaster, an author of books. Her work is smart, it's honest, it's brave, and that's in character. She's been a, well, let's say this right, a karate teacher, a portrait artist, a weightlifter. She's licensed to kill polar bears, although thankfully hasn't. But she is a brilliant writer of books like this one that you can see here, which is a history of global concentration camps. And we'll talk about in a minute because that's become frighteningly relevant to us here. Or as she puts it, it's a biography of a bad idea. And that bad idea is one that we seem to have taken. Andrea, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me on, even if the reasons that we're talking to each other are not necessarily great reasons.
Well, I'll get to that too in a minute, but just let's start with and take off the table, because I want to talk about many things. But before we began, you were telling us how we are already this kind of country where you see these camp systems.
Yeah, one of the things I found in writing the book was literally since the turn of the 20th century, more than 100 years ago, every time a country starts doing the kind of things that we're doing, you see people saying, well, no, our camps aren't like those other camps. We aren't like that. It's something really hard to see when you're on the inside of it, but much easier to see when you're looking from the outside. And just because of that perspective I've had from going around the world and seeing all these places where they have done this kind of thing, I have to say definitively that we have become a concentration camp society. We still have a lot we can do about it, but we're already there.
Yeah, and as you taught me the last time we talked, Americans hear concentration camps and they default to World War II movies and death camps that were the transformation of concentration camps made by Nazis. But the concentration camps themselves long predated World War II and are in fact completely like the thing in that we have housed prisoners in the Dilley facility in Texas, or that thing they call Alligator Alcatraz. Can you hear me? We seem to be on a delay.
It's true. And the thing to keep in mind is that while those death camps that came in almost a decade into the start of the Third Reich, that were developed and put in mid-war to allow the mass extermination in these extermination centers that were centered on genocide, the concentration camp system the Nazis had existed for almost a decade prior to that. Mm-hmm. And it's those earlier camps that were not death camps. That is the kind of history that we are repeating. And that is the kind of thing that has existed in a number of different places around the globe in that time. Yeah. I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can, but there's a delay. So we are having some internet issues, but I think we'll get through them. So I want to ask you, I mean, you've studied these terrible things, but are you optimistic or pessimistic about America's future?
A friend of mine asked me that a year ago, a little over a year ago, who was working on a book. And I would say the same thing now that I said to her then. I think that I am 55%, let's say, slightly optimistic. And it's a very weird push and pull because the reality is that we are at a place right now where things can go either way. We have an authoritarianism that is hardening and working very hard to tear down ways to resist. But we also have a tremendously powerful public presence of people doing just that on the streets across the country in national protests. We have a lower courts that are still defying the government openly. And as long as those things keep working, we have a really good chance to beat this, but it will require people to show up as they have been, but in even greater numbers. So I'm optimistic if Americans choose to act. And if they don't, then it could all be taken away. We've seen that again and again in history.
So I share your cautious optimism. I am more optimistic than I was a year ago, even though the Supreme Court gave Donald Trump a year to consolidate power, and he has used it to consolidate his power. But in that year, Americans learned to fight back and have shown up, and the courts have held. So I'm more optimistic than I was a year ago, even though we have the strongest, most powerful presidency. Yep.
Yeah, well, I will say to agree with you on that front, to say that we are better placed than any society that I've looked at that has had these modern concentration camps. We are better placed because of the relative freedom that most Americans still have to make those changes. There's zero doubt in my mind that if we choose to act as a country, we can absolutely do it. And that would not have been true of many of these other places. So I don't think people should be feeling hopeless. I think they should be mobilizing and getting other people to show up.
So let's talk about that in a little more detail. Do you think if we show up, we'll be able to, let me say it this way, overturn this autocratic consolidation at the earliest possible opportunity?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's been going on actually for quite a long time. So we have a lot of work to do to overturn it, because you can trace it back to the war on terror stuff after 9/11, when we threw out a lot of our ideals and we started creating black sites and torturing people. You can run it farther back to when we started seeing immigrants demonized on a regular basis. When I grew up, I'm in my 50s, and I grew up in elementary school when the bicentennial happened. And I remember in West Virginia, which is not the most progressive state in the country, there was a celebration of immigrants who had built. And what it's turned into is the exact opposite in terms of what the government is saying today. So there's a lot more work we have to do to really change a number of our institutions and embrace a different kind of democracy than we have so far this century. But I do think that there are still a lot of things that we can interrupt. The damage is going to be there to things like research, scientific research, to universities, to public policy. The war damage from this, war of aggression we're doing in Iran that there was no reason to do. I think those are going to have a long tail toll. But in terms of reestablishing control over the government and beginning to undo all this, I think it can potentially happen in very quick order. And the disintegration of Trump himself as a person, I think, is increasing the likelihood that, even of things like impeachment, which I would have said a few months ago were much less likely. I think that there are a lot of possibilities on the table, but even if those big dramatic ones don't happen, I think that we're going to see the shifts in the election. I think the number of people that are saying things like abolish ICE, there's tremendous potential to make big changes very quickly.
So, you've watched these processes around the world. There are many people, Democrats, who counsel, if we win, for God's sake, look forward, pay no attention to what's happened before. Don't never impeach again. Look forward only. Don't hold anybody accountable. Look what happened the last time we tried to hold them accountable. Just move forward. I have my own thoughts about that, but I'd love to hear yours.
So there was some time in my life where I probably would have agreed with that. I think that what has happened in the last certainly 2 decades, I think has made it clear that that is a terrible idea, because we have the direct example of Gitmo that I was referring to before, and Barack Obama coming in and saying, well, we tortured some folks, but we're going to just move on. We're not going to dwell in the past, right? We're going to move forward. And we saw that Gitmo wasn't closed. People who the government said and understood had tortured human beings, had set up these black sites, had sort of helped defeat and dismantle pieces of democracy among our allies that we pushed into hosting these sites. Much as I would say right now, we are pushing people who can be bribed or coerced into it, into holding immigrant detainees on our behalf. So not only are we talking about a concentration camp system domestically, we're talking about doing it overseas, which is damaging to those countries as well as to our own democracy.
And even less oversight.
Yeah. That Obama, who I think thought was less oversight and more potential harm. And in addition, that with Obama, I think he really thought, let's end this and move on, because he thought the country would coalesce and come together around it. But as Mark Fallon, who I interviewed for my book, who actually was one of the few people to stand up against torture at Gitmo, right as it was being implemented, and paid a career cost for that he has said Obama thought that he was moving on, but all he was doing was hitting the pause button. And I think now we have seen the danger on letting the past be the past, not having that kind of accountability. And the answer is that stuff stays embedded in the foundations of the democracy that you build, and it weakens the future that you can have. And I think whether it's impeachment or whether it's another form, whether it's prosecutions, I think we are going to have accountability for some of what is happening now. There are literally war crimes underway overseas and domestically. We see court orders being violated on a regular basis. We see human rights abuses that are not in line with our laws or the treaties that we've made elsewhere. And I think if we just give all that a pass, then in 4 more years, even if we were to have great elections this time and in 2028, we have already seen it is possible for this to return and return again. And historically, from concentration camp societies, we know that when it comes back, it's worse. It gets worse over time. So that's my opinion, but you may differ.
No, I don't differ. And I have one additional reason, in addition to your wonderful ones, and that is it's related to Jeffrey Epstein. We have for a long time weakened our democracy by not holding people accountable, the powerful people accountable. And ordinary Americans like me are like, well, why do I have to play by the rules when they don't? Well, I mean, what is the use of this democracy if it was working for those guys up there and not the rest of us? This holds true not just for the truly horrid acts of torture, but for not a single banker being held accountable after 2008 when they destroyed the economy. Right? We don't hold powerful people to account in the same way. And ordinary Americans have figured it out. I would like to think that the impetus of all of this furor over Jeffrey Epstein was an actual passion to care for his victims, but I know that's not true. But it was ordinary Americans saying, what about all these fancy people getting away with all this stuff? When do we live in a country where the rule of law applies to everybody? And that's going to have to be true for the war crimes and for the, I live in Chicago. I watched what ICE did here. Those are crimes and they need to be held accountable for them. And Minnesota is suing the federal government in order to get the evidence so they can go after the killers of Renee Good and Alex Preddy. We need to do this stuff if we're going to heal as a nation.
I think so. And I think that the Good example is especially important, Renee Good, because they've literally said there doesn't even need to be an investigation, right? That is a tremendous level of hubris to say we're going to shoot an American citizen in the face and it doesn't need to be investigated. And in fact, you can't have the evidence and you can't even conduct an investigation at the state level. I think that kind of thing has to be addressed. But it does go, as you're saying, to this larger issue of the concentration camp society is never just about concentration camps, right? It's about how power is used. And what we have fostered in this country, I think it's very much, and this is aside from my expertise, so it's one step out of my wheelhouse, but it's still related, is this income inequality that we've seen. And so these power differentials that get put into the system. And when you have a billionaire class that can literally buy everything off, it's incredibly dangerous. And that what you described about the sort of people in the streets realizing that nobody is held to account, even as they themselves get held to account, right? But nobody powerful does. That was when I have visited different countries, when I visited Russia, when I visited places that weren't democracies, Myanmar. I was doing research for the book in a number of countries. The biggest difference I saw 15, 20 years ago between the US and these other countries was that kind of everyday corruption, where it was just understood you could not hold those people accountable, right? And I remember thinking at the time, there's corruption in the US, and certainly there's corruption that isn't caught, but we aren't there yet. But now when I look around, we are so much closer to that kind of thing. When the contracts are no bid contracts, they're given to somebody's friends. It looks like there's market timing at the highest levels. That all mixes in with these human rights offenses that are ICE operations or camps. And it's really, I think, one bigger thing. And that's another reason to have accountability, because there needs to be visible, more than just performative, but at the same time, really visible actions to show that people are accountable at the highest levels. And if they're not, then I don't think you can actually have a functioning democracy.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we got here from so many causes. Some of them are, social media showed up at a dangerous time in our country, and when politicians learn to weaponize hate in the way they have. But a Supreme Court that says, money is speech, and unlimited money is okay, and unlimited dark money is okay, also undermines our faith that we can have a government that actually works. So we have a lot of work. My next question to you was like, okay, let's say we win these elections. Like, what are the things that we have to do to strengthen the democracy, to make it more legitimate in the eyes of its stakeholders or citizens, and to protect it from talented charlatans in the future?
So I think that there are a number of things. And first and foremost, I think, speaking from the concentration camp side, you have to stop a concentration camp society, you have to stop being willing to throw any community under the bus. And you may think, oh, well, this one, it's okay to do that too. These people came here illegally, or whatever thing, or trans people. We see the different groups that are targeted for hate right now. And you might think some of your listeners might say, well, that one kind of makes sense. But what I will tell you from my perspective of looking at this across 100 years is that as soon as you say it makes sense for that group to preferentially isolate them in some way, or everybody. And so the critical thing is first to stop that. The second thing I would say is you have to address the two sort of spokes. I'll have to come up with a better metaphor, but the two paths by which this happens. And the way it happens is by people who have a tremendous amount of money and power propagandizing in order to entrench that power and expand that power. And the way that they do it is by finding these cultural fissures through which they can motivate, terrorize, and infuriate the public. And that propaganda model, it just works. So we have to make it disadvantageous. We have to have the moneyed class to have less free money to do that with. So the billionaires to actually pay their fair share. And that has a double loop thing of everyday people start to see that accountability in force, right? Because you can't just say, we need to defend the vulnerable. I think that's important to say, but we also have to say, guess what? You're part of the vulnerable too. And we're actually defending everybody. And so you have to both remove the financial and power structures that allow that to happen. And you have to build guardrails in your democracy so that groups can't be targeted in these particular ways. And I think that that's a difficult thing to do in the US because of our tradition with free speech, which I also uphold. And I think as a journalist, I think is critical. But we see, as you've mentioned, social media is just one example, ways in which that stuff can be weaponized tremendously. And I saw that again and again around the globe. And so I think that we have to really provide resources for everybody across the country. And I would say that would be Medicare for all. I would say that would be some of the Medicaid protections that Kamala Harris was talking about in her campaign. And it might seem not intuitive that that helps build democracy, but it absolutely does if people are feeling that they are part of a democracy that is looking out for their interests and supporting them and their loved ones. Then they are more willing to engage in it in a civic sense and to not tolerate the kind of corruption when they see that there's channels that are addressing it. So that's a really big answer for you. But I think that the answer is definitely not to say, well, let's give in a little bit on this kind of hatefulness or that kind of hatefulness. Mm-hmm. I think the answer is actually to say, how do we build a democracy that protects every single American, except maybe the billionaires? We need to target them a little bit more.
Your answer strikes me as an answer that is true for civil society, regardless of its governing structure. If you want to have a cohesive big society, you have to do, it may not be a democracy, but you still have to have, you still have to treat people in a way that doesn't have them say that whatever this structure is isn't working for me. And you know, here, so I would add to the stuff you're talking about some of the actual reforms that we have to do to tweak the democracy itself, but the civil society stuff, the basic fairness, the treating everybody the same stuff goes at creating a cohesive society, one that's both harder to do, but also much harder to do badly in a big, diverse country like ours.
And so I think that we have to, I mean, one of the people that I just saw talking about this idea that I hadn't really thought of before in this context, but it actually makes a lot of sense, is what you see some of the Rahm Emanuel types doing right now, just to use a Chicago example, is what some people have termed white reconciliation, that you are so willing to try to reconcile with these lost, angry Trump voters, right? That you are actually getting rid of and harming some of your own base constituency. And anything you're doing where you're actually losing your base is not going to help build the larger democracy in the long run. Those estranged white voters cannot be wooed by doing harm to your own base. The way that they can be wooed is by providing a vision that they see will also benefit them. And the more time we stay stuck in these conversations around culture war conversations, and I'm not saying don't ever support different communities, because I absolutely stand up and support them. But the end result is you have to have a plurality of views in this democracy in which everybody understands they're getting something out of it. So you make the positive vision that people move toward. And there's specific things that you do to do that. I think a return of the fairness doctrine. I think promotion of educational options and funding for making different kinds of college available, actually looking at other programs for people that are looking for other routes. It really is a combination of a kind of economic security and accountability for everybody, while you simultaneously insist on protecting vulnerable groups. And it's going to play out different ways across the country. But I think we see both in my state of Virginia, where I am right now, Abigail Spanberger, and we see Zoran Mamdani, two very different places, one city, one state, but where you have seen executives elected to the senior positions of those polities really saying, we are going to improve the situation and things on affordability and things like with specific programs, right? With childcare, with rent, in all these different ways, while we simultaneously say, you know what, every New Yorker is a New Yorker and every Virginian is a Virginian. And I think sometimes when you see some of these pundits doing 4D chess, and then you wonder, like, what at the end of this have you done except maybe win an election? Elections are important, but if you don't have an agenda, you aren't going to be able to put in that agenda after the election anyway. And so my thought is build that movement, and then you will be able to actually achieve the things that will establish democracy more fully, because we have seen democracy collapse in shocking ways over the last year. Even as you and I remain optimistic about what the people can do, I don't think you or I, either one, I'm just guessing, correct me if I'm wrong, but thought universities would crumble the way that they have, thought that the military wouldn't stand up more to these changes that Hegseth has been making, that we wouldn't see more resignations, that we wouldn't see more of these kinds of things happening. And so I think the answer is, like, our institutions have to change. So when I see some centrist Democrats or Democratic leadership say in Congress saying things like we need to reform ICE, and then they make a list of things which are already existing for the most part, like covered under statutes already. Like, that's not actual reformation of ICE, right?
No.
And so one of the lines that I say that I think sometimes helps people see it is the answer in 1933 to Dachau, the correct answer was not better training for the guards. You know,
Right.
and so I think this
That's
approach that we reform things a little bit to get by and not make people upset is how we got where we are. So that's a very long answer to your short question.
No, it was brilliant. But look, when you're talking about this question, as you called it, white reconciliation, there is, I don't want, I think it's legitimate for us to say, after the Civil War, we had a period of Reconstruction, and then the majorities in the North and the South got together and said, yeah, we really don't need to worry about any of that for another 100 years. We can go back and have Jim Crow and put the country back together and forget about this little dispute we had. And that is not a path that I think is, thank God, I don't think it's open to us, but it's also not a moral choice. It's not an ethical choice. It's not a choice that faces a future. It's not a strategic choice. In every way, it's the wrong choice, cruel as it is. And we've made that mistake before. It is legitimate to raise it now and say, let me give a different example, not from the US. In Israel, they had a prime minister who was trying to make peace, Yitzhak Rabin, and he was shot by the right wing, and the society was divided in half. And they said, oh no, we have to reconcile and come together. And the right wing ate their lunch, and now we see what it's wrought in that country, right? So, so to the peacemakers on my side of the aisle, I want to say, you can make peace, but you can't make peace by rolling over.
I think that the mistake is when, and we see this all the time, when you go in with concessions, you're leading with concessions, and that makes clear right from the start who has the actual power, right? If you are leading with giving things up, you're not controlling anything. You are completely ceding to your opposite side's arguments. And so I think the answer is there will be difficult decisions. We like to pretend like there's a clean line between sort of being human and politics, and there isn't lower than that. But I think that you just because not everybody will get what they want in the long run doesn't mean you give up everything up front. And I think it absolutely doesn't mean that you give up whole communities to being savaged in some way or having their rights taken away. Because literally, as soon as I said before, and I know everybody knows the poem from Niemöller, and I always try to think of like how to come at this from a different way. But what I have seen again and again, just so people can hear it fresh, is in each society, because of the way that society was, people said, oh, but this group, they really are a problem for us. So we're going to have to do something about it. And as soon as that do something about it is not fix it, but is instead, we need to punish them in some way, status by locking them up. As soon as you let a government take that role on, you are undoing everything that protects that from being done to you. And it's important to say, well, if you're maybe somebody out there who's listening as a Trump supporter and you think, oh, he wouldn't do that to me, what I would say is that across history, again and again, when societies get to this point, that what ends up happening becomes sometimes far larger and far different than what the leaders originally imagined when they unleashed this stuff. And so even if there's some political actor, somebody who comes in after Trump, or some Democrat that's running things that you say, oh, this person would never do that. They don't even have to decide to do that, because this moves at a deeper and a bigger level than any individual policy, right? And so I think that it's fine for us to have knockdown, drag out politics and differ over different things. But when I see these centrists wanting to make concessions right off the bat, anybody who really knows like rhetoric and messaging at all, if you talk to them, they will say, you have already lost. But yet we see the Democratic Party has kind of been in this mode. And I think in some ways it's a little to blame on Obama for, I think he had a vision of us as a country that is maybe a little better than we really are. And we have to be realistic about our institutions and how good and how strong they are. And I think what's been revealed is we need to strengthen those institutions tremendously, because I know that, for instance, when Russia invaded Ukraine, I was actually in Moscow at that time doing research. And I came home and all these people said, the Russians are just bad people. That's why they do these things. And you'll hear some people say the Israelis are just bad people, or you will hear people say the Palestinians are just bad people. And what I have found again and again is that people actually aren't that different all around the world. Cultures are different, but people themselves are not that different. And it is the institutions in the societies that encourage them to be worse or to be better. And there is no people, Americans included, that will not do terrible, terrible things if you have enough propaganda and the institutions are weak enough. So addressing both of those things is critical.
There was that study at Stanford years ago, Millman, that showed that people would do terrible things if given the right circumstances. Look, you packed a lot in there, and I'm thinking about this notion of society strengthening in ways. And you said, like, if they come after one group, they'll come after everybody. And history has shown that's certainly true, right? But it's also true that if you live in a society where it's okay to go after one group, I mean, the founders of the country knew how dangerous that was, because they lived with a king that would do that. So they did everything they could to say the freedom in this, or the liberty they called it, in this new nation requires that we not let our government do these things. Absolutely, just don't let them do it. And somehow we've scared ourselves so much that we are letting our government do the things that would have appalled people in the late 1700s.
And it's true that I think that you see this idea. I mean, the fear is a real thing. And I think that the founders, super problematic people, but they had this vision, and it was a pretty good vision. They imagined somebody like Trump, and they thought they built a system that would protect against him. But what they didn't realize, and my personal opinion is, I think 20th century propaganda through various kinds of media, through radio and then through television and now social media, I think is so much more powerful even than the newspapers, which they had at that time were pretty wild. Yep. There was a lot of propaganda going on there too, but the speed and power of when you combine the visuals and the auditory and the written, it's more powerful. And so I think that they failed to see this window in which you would not have a Congress that would stand up for its own interests and its own power, right? And I think that I would, not to make it all about billionaires all the time, but I do think that when you have a billionaire class that can offer so much more than you can get through public service, that in fact, in some ways has more power than almost anybody but the president, and sometimes some pretty co-equal power to that, I think that the temptations of what can be offered to you from that clique and those people become tempting in a way that they couldn't have been at the founding. There was so much power in being a senator. A U.S. senator was a power, and it still is. But in my lifetime, I have seen a decline of the power, the relative power of a US senator. And so I think that a number of people have been willing to go along with these changes, even as we see the whole slate of them in 2016 very clearly naming exactly what Donald Trump was, right? There was no mystery. It wasn't that they didn't get it, but they got more interested.
Yeah, because of courtesy of the Supreme Court, they work for the map makers and the money as opposed to the voters.
Exactly.
And that is a change.
We helped create that. I would say with those Reagan tax cuts was a huge first step, because when you just sort of glommed on this additional, much more powerful group that helped off kilter, basically, the balance of the country. And when you combine that with the power of 20th century propaganda, which I will tell you works everywhere on every kind of person. Sure. And if you think that you are immune, you are wrong. If you stew in it enough, you will see it happen. And some of us have relatives where we've seen this process, right?
All of us have those relatives. But Andrea, I want to push back a little on social media and all of this stuff, because we don't live in a place where where opposition can't be found on the media. And I'm sure you found this even in Russia, where there wasn't opposition you could see on the media, but it was very secret in somebody's living room, for example. As long as people are able to, as long as the truth can be found, there are going to be people who want to find it. And I think Absolutely. This social double-edged sword of social media, while corporate news has been hijacked by the very class you're talking about on behalf of an autocratic administration, the idea that you and I can talk, that, by the way, for those of you who are watching, go find degenerate art. And I'm not talking about the exhibit in the 1930s. Andrea actually has a newsletter that's fabulous. The fact that we can do stuff like that now, I mean, Americans are, 60% disapproving of this president and this administration? All their propaganda has certainly floated their boat, but it has not saved them.
Well, and that's why I 100% agree. So actually, you're not even having to push back. You've already convinced me that I think that it is a double-edged sword, and I'm not somebody who would get rid of social media. I've had actually not just my own financial benefit from a career, which has been a lot of social media, but also to disseminate the ideas that I've had. I've been able to do as an independent journalist in extraordinary ways. And so I think the promise there is huge, but the weight of the money and power is very much on the other side of the balance. And I would say you are foolish if you think that you are not being exposed to that in the ether, that those ideas aren't creeping in, that they aren't affecting those arguments those pundits and consultants are making in ways that are unhelpful. The example I use a lot is in England, in the UK, 10 years ago, you started seeing this massive wave of like anti-trans journalism. And it was in liberal newspapers. I had intellectual friends that are college professors, and they saw it all the time. And I saw these ideas take hold in concrete ways and actually shift in a population that before that I had, and it was an extraordinary thing to watch. And so it's just to say to people, be aware of how you spend your time and what you're looking at. And I think you do have to reach out. And yes, in Russia, I have a number of Russian friends, some of whom have been arrested multiple times. They're demonstrators, have done all kinds of things. They're on VPNs now. And I think it would be naive not to know that each additional step you make it harder to access that good information, like VPNs that they have to go on, the fewer people that are going to hear it. So what I found when I was there in February 2022, among a group of people who are pretty informed, they all thought, no, Russia's not going to invade. I mean, we've been there 10 years. It's already a low-grade war, but we're not going to do some big thing. That's just, overseas propaganda. And I said, no, I'm coming to visit you and to finish my research because I might not see you again. And they were like, that's silly. Smart people who had access to information. So it's just to say that, that's not all just a plea to subscribe to my newsletter. It's also a plea to build journalistic institutions. I'm somebody who thinks that journalism should be a public good and that we should find a way to make sure that it is funded, because I think you cannot have an informed democratic public in a functioning society if there is not some base of journalism that is secured, that can't fall prey, as CBS News has just this year, as the Washington Post has in the last 2-3 years, as the LA Times. We have these major institutions that have fallen in significant ways in terms of their ability to report what's going on. So I do think we need to find, even as we have all these little great independent folks doing good things, we need to have institutions that are doing it as well. It can't only be the New York Times that could stand up to a federal lawsuit if they decide to really go after journalism, right? We need to have a healthier ecosystem than that.
Yeah, I was the CEO of the Chicago Sun-Times at part of my life, kept it alive when it was falling apart. And local news is enormously important to me. But I don't think we're safer if we sell all those to billionaires and hope their charity will keep them afloat. I do want to think it's valuable and individuals will pay something for it. And I hope they do. And whether that's you signing up for your work or for these institutions, they need to be supported by ordinary Americans. And we just have to understand how important that is.
And I think they need to see their own interests reflected in it as well. And that's where local city newspapers and everything come in. I think it's critical. Like, somebody needs to be at those city council meetings. Somebody needs to be at the school board meetings, because we have seen what happens already when that doesn't get covered. And now just imagine less coverage. Human nature is such, I don't think most people are bad people, but there is a percentage of people who will do bad things. And if you leave the hen house unguarded, some fox is going to find it. And so my point is not to say that foxes are inevitable and that humans are bad and we're doomed. It's more just, we have to create structures of accountability, and we have to create oversight, and local journalism, city newspapers, really alt weeklies, super important stuff.
Yeah. And I think people are great. I don't think people are fox. I mean, we got our share out there, but I think most people are great.
It's a small percentage, really.
Yeah, most people are great. And we have figured out time and again, we figure out how to create these institutions that last for a while. And then we're in this time where we have to figure out how to create them again in this new world we're in. And that's part of what we have to do after we throw these animals out of the White House. Okay, it's a stretch.
I think so. And I think that we have to think about how to keep it from happening again. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I've loved our conversation. Let's do it again, maybe with a better internet connection next time.
Thank everybody for your patience today. Yeah.
No, a pleasure. Thank you all. Look, go find Andrea Pitzer's work. You can find her books, look them up. There's one right there. That one is absolutely terrifying. Actually, all your books are kind of terrifying. They're interesting, but they all have this scary undertone of rediscovering something that happened in the past that we may have forgotten about, but we shouldn't have in her work. And it's great, but also go find Degenerate Art, which is her newsletter. It's a community, comes with things like this, where she's online talking to people, as well as written stuff. So it's worth paying attention to. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edwin. I really